I'm just waiting for, there we go. Okay. Now I believe it's recording. So anyhow, I just wanted to start off by addressing Bethany's question from yesterday about kind of the collapse of the first party system and something called the era of good feelings. So Bethany, I don't think you'll be writing an essay directly on that. In fact, I know you won't, but I can help you make sense of what the term means. So we know what the first party system is. That's the Federalists and the Jeffersonians, our Federalists and our Republicans, debating the role of, how big should the federal government be. After the War of 1812, which again it's not that important of a topic for this class, guys. After the War of 1812, we entered like a 20-year period from 1812 into the 1820s. They call the era of good feelings. It's between the first and second party system. The president during that time is James Monroe, James Madison. Oh man, I'm forgetting the other one or two. And it's not important that you remember the name of the presidents during that period, Bethany. When you think era of good feelings, just be like, oh, that's the era when we don't really have a whole lot of partisan back and forth, a lot of partisan debate over major issues like we will in the second party system and like we do in the first party system. So I think it's when I was reading that last night and this morning, I kind of thought it makes actual sense because I don't know a lot about that period, that kind of period of the War of 1812 till we get to Andrew Jackson. There's not a lot of internal conflict between different factions of Americans. And so, it doesn't really come up in the class a whole lot. And so again, that period of time from the end of the War of 1812 till really the election of Andrew Jackson in the 1820s, we know that as the era of good feelings, just because there seems to be a really limited amount of partisan conflict. The Federalist Party has collapsed. The Republican Party has maintained a lot of its strength. And again, there's just not a lot of partisan bickering and divide over issues during this period until it is kind of renewed with the second party system, Jacksonian Democrats and Whigs in the 1820s under Andrew Jackson. Obviously, there are probably more details for the era of good feelings, Bethany, but I think if you can remember that it just represents the period in between the first and second party system, and you understand what both the first and second party system is, I think you're going to be just fine. So that's how I would answer that and handle that one. Cool. Yeah, great. Let's see. Other questions, guys, that we had yesterday had to do with like Supreme Courts and political parties, and just sit tight for those because I'm going to bless you, Amelia. I see you having a sneeze attack. I know that people had basically questions about all the different groups of political parties in the Supreme Court cases, guys, and I'll record a little video. I guess we could do it live if you want, but maybe I should just record it by myself so it's nice and professional and planned. I don't know, but I promise you there will be an individual video for, Supreme Court cases and political parties right there. Hold on, my student teacher, Andy, just texted me something. Oh, okay. Anyhow. All right, folks, let's go ahead and screen share. And let's talk a little Andrew Jackson for a moment. Chapter 10, for those of you that are following along on your learning targets. All right, we did American system yesterday. I told you not to focus on the Cruft bargain. That's 1824. Don't worry about it, please. We focused on the tariff and how Andrew Jackson handled when South Carolina threatened to secede. And now let's talk about the bank war and Indian removal. That's what we'll do today, folks. So remember, the bank war, the Bank of the United States, we've had a Bank of the United States since Alexander Hamilton proposed it in like the late 1790s right there. That was that big debate. There were some Hamilton songs about it that we looked at. But the Bank of the United States is a thing. It is printing and regulating currency and the value of paper dollars. It is making it so you don't have all these different state banks printing their own individual currency. And it's also providing federal loans to different individuals and businesses. That's part of the American system. It fits in with Hamilton's plan. But remember that Andrew Jackson and many of the Jacksonian Democrats and the states' rights people, they do not believe that the bank is constitutional, and so they want to kill it. So here's the situation. We have the Bank of the United States, and it's run by a bunch of non-elected officials, specifically a dude named Nicholas Biddle is the head of the bank. Guys, they have a lot of power. They can control who gets loans and who doesn't. They can technically control the value of the dollar. They can control how much money is printed and therefore in circulation. This is really a very powerful institution, and the men are not elected officials. And so there's all sorts of charges of like corruption and favoritism. I honestly don't know if they're true. There's probably some truth to that stuff. That stuff is normally at least partially true. But just be aware, kind of the small guys in the country, the states' rights people, the people who question big federal authority, they don't like the Bank of the United States. They think it's just this big, monstrous, unaccountable government agency that's not even constitutional. And so remember, Jackson, there's all sorts of cartoons about him slaying the monster bank. I guess I'll pull one up real quick. just so it'll hopefully remind you. Let's do Jackson Bank War cartoons. Oops. And you guys, you'll remember some of these. This is Andrew Jackson slaying the many-headed monster known as the bank. The different heads are different bank. The different heads of the monster, the different bank administrators. You don't have to know all the details of the cartoon, but just be aware of what it represents, guys. It's Andrew Jackson using his authority of the president to to kill an institution that many Americans question its validity. Now, guys, the Bank of the United States, I don't believe is a bad thing in this era. You're not debating whether or not it's a good thing. You have to have a pretty complex economic understanding to assess that fact. But the point is what the debate is over, whether or not it's constitutional. It is constitutional, according to several Supreme Court rulings there. So here's the deal. Andrew Jackson wants to kill the bank, but the members of Congress think they're going to outsmart him. They're going to renew its charter before it even expires. Because remember, guys, the bank operates on a charter. A charter is like your license to operate. And it's going to expire in a couple of years, but they want to renew it because they want to catch Andrew Jackson in a damned if you do, damned if you don't. They want to basically try to catch him in a trap. They know that if Andrew Jackson vetoes the bank, because remember, they're going to pass a law reauthorizing it. The president has to sign every law. So when they pass the law reauthorizing the bank, they know it's going to go on Andrew Jackson's desk, and they think he's going to veto it. And they think that this will cause him to lose the presidential election, guys. They think Andrew Jackson will look stupid, like he won't look like he knows what banking is all about. Remember, guys, Congress passes a law. That's technically the will of the people. Those are the people's representatives. And so if Andrew Jackson vetoes a law about banking because he personally dislikes the bank, he's basically overruling the voice of the people. So again, the Whigs and the people in the bank really think they've got Jackson trapped. We're going to pass the legislation. He's going to veto it, and he's going to look like an idiot and lose the election. But that is not what happens, guys. Andrew Jackson vetoes the bank, and it turns out to be a really popular move among Americans. He ends up essentially vetoing the bank. He wins re-election, and then he not only vetoes the bank's renewal, guys. Remember, a bank can't operate if it doesn't have any money. Andrew Jackson wants to kill the bank, not just make sure it doesn't extend its life in a couple of years. He wants to kill it now. And this is where he withdraws all of the funds out of the federal treasury and deposits them in Democratic-controlled state banks. Those are called Jackson's pet banks. Sorry, I have to sneeze now. Amelia sent me her sneeze through the internet. 1 second. Bless me. Guys, I don't know if you caught all those details. There's all sorts of videos about the bank war, and it's okay if you forget one of the details, but just please be aware of what the debate is over. It's about the constitutionality of the Bank of the United States and whether or not people feel that the federal government should have those type of financial powers. The bank really does have a lot of control over the economy. It can really impact people's lives, guys. You might live and die whether or not you get that loan from the Bank of the United States. So please, you've got to understand both perspectives. You've got to understand the Jacksonian Democrats' perspective. These are unelected officials. They can set rates and interest rates and decide who gets loans. They play favoritism. This might not even be constitutional. You got to understand that perspective. And then you also understand the modern Hamiltonian perspective of banking, debt, lending, and international trade and commerce. Andrew Jackson is successful at killing the bank. He is successful at removing the funds from the bank, and he will win re-election. It's a win-win for him. There are probably a few more details for the bank war. I mean, guys, you can read about them if you want to. I just tried to figure out a way to try to summarize it in a minute or two for you. You won't get a DBQ just on the bank war. You would get a DBQ on the Jackson presidency, guys. So that's why it's important to remember, I don't know every single detail about the bank war, but I remember kind of it in the narrative of the second party system of Whigs versus Jacksonian Democrats. I don't remember every single detail about the tariff of abominations, but I know what it is in the context of the debate between Whigs and Democrats, the proper role of the federal government. Hopefully that makes sense for bank war, guys. Before I do Indian removal real quick, does anyone have any questions on bank war that I can maybe try and clarify? I don't know if my explanation worked or if it sucked. Speak up if you need any more information on bank war. Cool. Then let's do causes and consequences of the Indian Removal Act, guys. Obviously, the major cause of conflict with Native Americans is competition for land and resources. As Americans move further west, and I don't care if you're British colonists in the 1600s in Massachusetts fighting, the Wampanoag, or you are, Americans in the 18 teens trying to displace the Cherokee in the South, the southern cotton growing region of the United States. It's ultimately going to result in or be caused by tensions over land. So think about the market revolution for a minute, guys. Market revolution is creating a huge demand for cotton. All those cotton factories, remember we talked about the Lowell factory girls and stuff, that cotton is coming from slave producing states in the South. So it's important that you understand that the demand, the worldwide demand for cotton, not just in the northern states, but in Europe, all around the world, this worldwide demand for cotton, and Eli Whitney's cotton gin making it so much easier to get the seeds out and making it more profitable really dictates that we expand cotton operations. When your business is doing well, you expand it. You don't just let it sit there stagnant, you expand it. And so where we're going to expand our businesses, guys, is in the modern states of Alabama, Louisiana, Mississippi, the deep South, also places like in Georgia as well. And this is essentially the homeland of multiple tribes. It's not just the Cherokee, it's the Chickasaw, the Choctaw, the Creek, the Seminole, 8 or 9 or 10 other tribes that I don't remember off the top of my head. And you don't have to know the names of the tribe, folks, but you have to understand that there are tribes living in the southeastern States in the United States in the 1800s, early 1800s. And because of the demands and pressures for not only cotton production, but just everyday farmers moving out west, guys, not everyone moving west is creating a cotton plantation. But remember, it's kind of this American dream to have land to leave to your future generations. And so again, Americans will consistently be obsessed with this idea of moving further west to either hack out a little farmstead for themselves or move further west so they can acquire the mineral wealth that might be out there. Native Americans stand in the way. So what we have, folks, is the Cherokee tribe in modern day Georgia, and they have been declared a sovereign nation. They have their own Cherokee laws, and according to federal law right now, the Cherokees are sovereign, essentially, and the state of Georgia has to respect their boundaries. But Georgia isn't respecting their boundaries, guys, and they're also trying to make Georgia law apply on Cherokee land. For example, Georgia might have a law about mining. Every state's got their own kind of mining laws. Georgia is going to make it legal to go mine gold on Cherokee land. Despite what the Cherokee say about it, Georgia's going to pass laws saying you are allowed to do this. They have other laws, and the one that will go to Supreme Court is actually about swearing an oath of allegiance. They want every state employee of Georgia to swear an oath of allegiance, and I'll get to that in a moment. But just be aware, guys, that the conflict is over Georgia trying to apply Georgia state laws onto Cherokee land. And obviously, these Georgia state laws, guys, are very offensive to the Cherokee. It's allowing white squatters and white settlers to come into Cherokee land, typically to mine gold. That is what Georgia's doing. They're violating the Cherokee sovereignty. So we've got a white Christian missionary, and he's also a state of Georgia employee, and his name is Daniel Worcester. This is a Supreme Court case you must know, guys. Actually, pause real quick. Before I get to Worcester, I need to just talk about the Indian Removal Act. I got ahead of myself. I'm already talking about the Cherokee and the Trail of Tears and everything. Just pause for 1 second. What the Indian Removal Act is, guys, this is a law. And what this law does is it allows the president to create Indian land in Oklahoma and allow for the tribes to be compensated and move there. Now, when they say compensated, guys, they are technically giving the tribes money for this land. They're making them, vacate their homelands, and we're paying them for that. But it's not like it's voluntarily. You don't have a choice often whether or not you give up your homeland. So again, all the Indian Removal Act does is it creates Indian territory in modern day Oklahoma, and it allows the government to pay Indians to move off of their land. Now, if the Indians don't go, we know what happens. They're ultimately going to get forced out at gunpoint, maybe compensated later. But ultimately, guys, we know how this is going to end up. So what the law does, again, it's designed to clear up this region for white American settlement. Not only for cotton production, but for general white American settlement. The law allows for the creation of this territory, and it allows the government to use taxpayer dollars to induce the Native Americans to move. Some will move voluntarily, some will not. Obviously, we know that the Cherokee and several other tribes, when they were forcibly be marched to the Indian reserves in Oklahoma, that'll be known as the Trail of Tears, where hundreds of them die. I don't know what percentage of the tribe dies on that march, but it's a forced march. So be aware of what the Indian Removal Act is, how it connects to the Trail of Tears, how it connects to something like the Market Revolution and westward expansion. Now let's talk about the Supreme Court case, Worcester v. Georgia. And this is what we'll end on, guys. So we have a white Christian missionary named Daniel Worcester. And Daniel Worcester is actually an employee for the state of Georgia. I believe he works in the post office. He's like a postal collector or something like that for Georgia. Maybe he works at a post office right outside the Cherokee Reservation. But either way, he's also a missionary. And while he's living and working on the Cherokee Reservation, he refuses to follow the state law of Georgia to swear the oath of allegiance. Seems like a silly law to me, but whatever, they have it. And Daniel Worcester is essentially fined for this. And his case, guys, will make it all the way to the Supreme Court. And it's not so important that you remember, like, wait, was Daniel Worcester a postman? Or like, what did he actually do? That's not important. What's important is you remember the outcome of the Supreme Court case, Worcester v. Georgia. And what the Supreme Court rules in Worcester v. Georgia is that the Cherokee are a sovereign nation with their own distinct boundaries, and that the laws of Georgia or any state are not applicable within the Cherokee's sovereign boundaries. He rules in favor of the tribe. Obviously, guys, the Supreme Court, though, doesn't really have any teeth to enforce anything. The Supreme Court can't call out the military and tell Georgia to stop violating the Cherokee sovereignty. So this is where Andrew Jackson makes the very famous comment, John Marshall has made his ruling, now let him enforce it. He won't stop the Cherokee, or he will not stop Georgia from violating the Cherokee sovereignty, guys. When the Supreme Court makes a ruling, it's basically the president's job to enforce it if the states aren't following along. Now, you guys all know what the Civil Rights Act, or the Civil Rights Movement in the 1960s about, and you've seen the images of, like, armed National Guardsmen escorting kids into school. Let me show you this for a second. I know you've seen it, but look at the image of the Little Rock Nine for a moment. Guys, why are there soldiers escorting these black kids into public school? I'll tell you why. Because the Supreme Court ordered it. The states refused to do it. And so two different presidents, Eisenhower and Kennedy, had to call out federal national troops to enforce the order. This is exactly what Andrew Jackson should have done to protect the Cherokee's sovereignty. When Georgia proved that they were not going to follow the order, this is exactly what Andrew Jackson was expected to do. As the president of the United States, you are expected to enforce the Supreme Court order. This is what it looked like in the civil rights era. But Andrew Jackson, guys, obviously is not going to enforce the Supreme Court order, and he's going to allow Georgia to violate the Cherokee sovereignty, ultimately ordering the federal government to march the Cherokee out of Georgia. I have no idea what they're compensated, guys. Again, the Indians are given small amount of money and supplies for their land, but be aware it's essentially taken from them. Sets a pattern, sets a precedent. You guys are well aware of it. I don't think I have anything else to say on Indian removal, but be aware, guys, of what the law is. The law creates the land out here in Oklahoma and allows the government to pay Indians to move there. And then understand what Worcester v. Georgia, that Supreme Court case, is all about. Cool. Any questions or comments before I stop the recording? I guess I'll stop screen sharing now if I can find the thing. Any questions, comments, anybody?
Could you talk about the Monroe Doctrine?
So I didn't talk about it, Madison, but I'll tell you what it is real quick. In the 18 teens, the Spanish Empire is starting to collapse, and most of Latin America is going to gain its independence in the 18 teens, including South American countries. And so what the Monroe Doctrine says, and we don't really do anything else with James Monroe, but what the Monroe Doctrine says, and remember, this is the era of when many European nations are starting to colonize other parts of the world in the second era of imperialism. Obviously, Europeans have been colonizing the world for a while, but the 1800s, there's kind of a renewed sense of it, especially in Africa. The Monroe Doctrine says, hey, Europe, all of these new baby nations that Spain essentially just lost, they are under our influence. And if you want Americans to stay out of your colonial nonsense going on abroad, you need to stay out of the Western Hemisphere. These nations, they're not saying that they're our possessions. They're just saying the Western Hemisphere is our sphere of influence, and we will not allow European nations to come into the Western Hemisphere and start colonizing and influencing politically these newly independent South American and Latin American nations.
Cool.
I want to just triple check and make sure that I didn't miss anything on that, because that's my off the top of my head understanding of it. I just want to make sure in 30 seconds I didn't miss anything else. Yeah, they would call it a defining moment in the foreign policy of the United States. Anyhow. Yeah, that's all I'm going to say on that. That is the Monroe Doctrine. You wouldn't get an essay on the Monroe Doctrine, but you could get an essay on evolutions in American foreign policy. Totally. So they might ask you a question, Madison, to like analyze changes in American foreign policy from like the 1820s to the end of the Spanish-American War in the 1890s or whatever. Could possibly be.
Because that kind of adds on to the isolation of like they won't go into Europe if Europe doesn't come here.
Great connection. That is exactly the type of comment that you would be expected to make. If you're telling the European nations that the Western Hemisphere is our sphere of influence, and if you guys stay out, then we'll basically stay out of European affairs, that can definitely, even though it's not saying we're going to stay within our borders, you could say it is a form of isolation. We're at least staying in our ballpark. But yeah, it's a warning to European nations not to come colonizing newly independent nations in Latin America and South America. Cool. Hopefully that was helpful. What else we got? Aaron, you got a question?
Yeah, just a quick one. So if you like got a question on that, like you were just saying, you would use like an example for evidence, like the one that we're just talking about, the Monroe Doctrine. But like, what's another good one that you would use probably?
Well, if I'm thinking about American foreign policy, I don't think this is a very likely topic. We don't have a lot of foreign policy stuff in this class in between the Monroe Doctrine of the 1820s and then later on the Spanish-American War. We have something in the late 1880s with Hawaii. We know that kind of stuff in the South Pacific. We know with Cuba and the Spanish-American War. But kind of from 1830 to 1870, 1880, we're really focused inward, guys. It's the Civil War taking up a huge chunk of that time. It's westward expansion and the crisis over slavery. I'm not so ignorant to think that there are no foreign policy issues that come up in American history during that time frame, but there's just really nothing that we're going to need to be responsible for this class, guys. Like I guarantee you a real historian could totally point out to a foreign policy issue during that period. Oh, you know what? I take that back. Now it sometimes just takes me a minute to think about it, Aaron. There's something called the Treaty of Burlingame in the 1860s. This is where we open ourselves up economically to China and Japan. And we actually forced Japan using the United States Navy to open up its ports economically to us. So that's something I would say is an important part of foreign policy that fits into this era. That's kind of some American 1860s foreign policy action. And it's economic foreign policy activity in Asia. You could look up Treaty of Burlingame. And I'm going to mispronounce the other one, but it's like Treaty of Kawangawa or something like that, 1860s. And in fact, the textbook chapter, it's probably in chapter 17 or 16. 16, I bet it is. Yep. It's right in the beginning of, it's right in the beginning of 16. It's the Burlingame Treaty. It's and again, I don't really think that that's a very high probability essay prompt, but it is there. It's on page 510 and 511 of the textbook. So if I had that prompt to analyze American foreign policy from 1820 to, the Spanish-American War, I would go from Monroe Doctrine to talking about our involvement in Asia in the 1860s to Spanish-American War. Remember, guys, we never have to be experts on those essays. We just have to say intelligent thesis statements and back them up with a couple examples. That's it. And I think I can make an intelligent statement about American foreign policy and then use those examples I just mentioned.
Perfect. But thank you.
It does take some practice. So
yeah, thank you.
Good question. Hopefully that was helpful. And again, those treaties, guys, and I didn't really talk much about them in class. They're 510 and 511. It's the Burlingame Treaty in China and the Treaty of Kawangawa with Japan. They're interesting. I think it's a low probability that essay prompt you'll be tested on, but maybe. Good question. What else do you got? Any other questions for me, folks? Can be about anything, any content, anything that's on your mind.
One of the questions on here, how did African Americans protect their dignity in family structures?
I would say through slave marriages, despite the fact that they can be absolutely broken up. You try to maintain, like when you're living in situations that, you know, are incredibly demoralizing, you look for ways to take your mind off it. And whether that is through work songs throughout the day, because I'm working in a plantation and this freaking sucks, and I've got to sing songs to kind of keep the rhythm and keep my mind off of the task. It kind of helps the time pass. So it sounds simple, Madison, but slave marriages, work songs, literally plantation work songs, African-American Christianity as found in the Southern Baptist Church, and I would say, you know, oral history, folk tales, and things of that nature. I don't think that'll be an essay question, but if you were to ask me how African Americans, you know, maintained their sanity or maintained social institutions, they absolutely tried to, you know, despite not having legal standing, they tried to recreate whatever social institutions they could, whether it was the church institutions or whether they were, you know, family institutions through slave marriages like that. I think that's the easiest answer. That won't be an essay question, but, you know, if you're asked about the experience of African Americans or about the growth and development of slavery, that could show an analysis point. I might be talking about the cotton gin and the sectional crisis and, you know, Kansas, Nebraska and all that stuff. But I'm also telling you, Mahoney, that these people are coping with slavery by developing, you know, social customs that, you know, make it livable, like marriage and attending church and having robust African American, you know, spiritual congregations. Hopefully that helps. Anything else for people on your review guide? You can ask me any questions on that you might have. When you're doing those review guides, are you finding them helpful at all? Or are you finding that they're kind of, you know, refreshing your memory on that stuff? Hopefully.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I like doing them. It's helpful.
Cool. All right, folks. Yeah, go ahead.
Could you maybe talk about the McCullough v. Maryland and Gibbons?
Yes, McCullough v. Maryland. Sure, I'll do that right now. I was going to do a different day on Supreme Court cases, but I'll just do that real quick, Madison, for you. So those are Marshall Court cases. And remember, the Marshall Court, those decisions tend to strengthen the authority of the federal government. So let's do McCullough v. Maryland right now. We have a Bank of the United States, guys, and Maryland doesn't like the Bank of the United States. So Maryland decides we're going to tax the bank out of existence. Every single transaction the bank does within our state, we're going to put a tax on that transaction. Guys, it's a strategy that sometimes local communities use today. If you don't want a business operating in your town, you could put a prohibitively large tax on it. That actually has really happened in towns with marijuana laws. Towns are allowed to put any tax on marijuana that they want to. So you could effectively keep a business out by taxing it to death. That's what Maryland tries to do to the Bank of the United States in the 18 teens right here, folks. Maryland says every transaction the bank does is subject to a state tax. That would make the cost of doing business for that bank just a headache and probably prohibitively expensive. So it gets challenged in court. And what the Supreme Court ultimately rules in McCullough v. Maryland is that the state cannot tax the Bank of the United States. States can't tax the federal government. What that means is that it strengthens the authority of the federal government ultimately, folks. It weakens the position of the states, strengthens the power of the federal government. I'm sure it's much more complex of a case than that, but that's all we have to know for the AP test. Who the decision benefits, and if you can just simply remember the detail about a state trying to tax the bank in order to, you know, stop it from operating within the state boundaries, you'll be okay. So that's McCullough v. Maryland. We already did Marbury v. Madison yesterday about judicial review. We're not even focusing on the case. We just know what judicial review means. Only the Supreme Court gets to determine the constitutionality of a law, not states. And we know the Kentucky and Virginia resolves tested that, and we know that the nullification crisis tested that. The other case that I think is on there is Gibbons v. Ogden. Let me look it up myself. I think that one has to do with interstate commerce. I'm almost positive that's the interstate commerce one. I don't even know what the case is. I'm trying to look it up in the textbook real quick. What chapter would be that? I think it was chapter 8. Yeah, had to have been 8. Sorry it's taking me so long, folks. I probably just could have thrown this into Wikipedia in the minute, and that's what I'm going to do. Gibbons v. Ogden. Yeah, Gibbons v. Ogden's interstate commerce, guys. I don't know anything about the case, and I don't want you to focus on the case at all. We don't have to know the case for this class. We just simply have to know that Gibbons v. Ogden gives the federal government the authority to regulate interstate commerce. And once again, that decision strengthens the authority of the federal government as opposed to the states. So that's Gibbons v. Ogden, interstate commerce, McCullough v. Maryland about the bank, Marbury v. Madison. Now, there were one or two other ones, guys. It's like Dartmouth v. Woodward, and that's about private property. So that one actually kind of goes in counter with the Marshall Court, but don't worry too much about it. It's about essentially contracts being incredibly important and essentially contracts being inviolable. I don't know if I use that word properly, the inviolability of contracts. That one's not as important of a case to know, but it is on the list. And again, I think that's Dartmouth v. Woodward. And that one is, again, upholding the rights of property owners into contractual obligation. And, you know, property rights are a pretty sacred thing in this country. And despite the federal government, you know, getting a lot of authority under the Marshall Court, we are going to continue to protect property rights pretty robustly in this country throughout our nation's history. But that's what that case is generally about. I've never even seen them ask about that one on the test, but it is on the list. Go ahead, Madison.
The Worcester v. Georgia part of the Marshall Court?
No, it is. Well, yes, it is part of the Marshall Court, but it doesn't. That one also, it's made. The ruling is made by Chief Justice Marshall, but it doesn't necessarily. Well, you know what? I guess it does strengthen the power of the federal government because it gives the federal government the authority to enforce the ruling over the state of Georgia. Don't focus on that one. Use McCullough v. Maryland, Gibbons Ogden, and Marbury v. Madison to make the point about them becoming stronger. Yes, Worcester v. Georgia is John Marshall, but I'm not trying to lawyer an argument for how like that Indian ruling is strengthening the power of the federal government, because really it's strengthening the authority of the tribe. You know, the government had the authority to enforce the ruling before that, but I don't know. I don't want to get anyone confused because I'm not a legal mind, so I certainly don't want to get anyone confused with anything like that because we won't be tested at that level, folks. Hopefully that was helpful. Gibbons v. Ogden, interstate commerce, McCullough v. Maryland, state can't tax the bank, and Marbury v. Madison, judicial review. Cool. And like I've said for the third time, there will be a robust, top 15 Supreme Court cases that I do, but that video already exists online, but you can get my spin on it. All right, guys, if you don't have any other questions, we'll go ahead and stop recording. Anything else before I stop it? Cool. It's like the same 15 people that are always here. I appreciate you guys very, very much. Reach out if you have any questions. All we're focused on, guys, is that AP test in a month. Bye, Odie. We'll do a project at the end of it, but it's pass fail. We don't need to go down that road again. But let me know what I can do to support you in any way prepping for this test.
Thanks, Mahoney.
You are welcome. Bye, guys.
Okay,
thank you.
Hey, Mahoney. Bye.
Bye.
Have a good weekend. Thank
You
you.
You too, everyone. Oh, there's your cat, Dre.